Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwindt.
I'm Jared Pechaček.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello, and welcome to the 14th episode of By-The-Bywater. Great to have you back. Great to have you with us. We all know the state of the world is not great, and frankly, we've spent too much time with the past two episodes sort of angsting about it. We all know where we stand. We all know what's going on. So we just hope you're well, or hope everyone you know is well, taking care, and we'll see it through as we do. So other than that, lovely day here. It'd be great to be outside, but again, can't really do that and all the rest of it. How's everyone hanging out weather-wise or otherwise?
It's amazing here in New York.
It's partly cloudy here.
Yours would be the best weather for
Seattle.
staying in. Yeah.
Yeah, it's about as good as it gets.
It is pleasant enough. We're moving into the warmer months. We'll see how it suits us. And again, we all know where we stand. Lord. So it was someone brought up something the other day talking about how the first time in they'd gone through a month of life and they realized, the first time I've ever gone through a month of life where I have not been in a car, a tram, or a bus. And I went, my God, that's the same thing with me.
Oh,
weird.
Yeah.
Just utterly weird.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
But, Tolkien, we know what Tolkien thought about internal combustion engines and all that. He'd probably approve. Not necessarily for the reasons, but he'd probably approve. So anyway, we could ramble on, but frankly, again, there's been too much of that. You all know where things stand. So let's just head on straight into it. We got a good main topic coming up, but right now, here we are with the news. Jared, please take it away.
Yeah, so we weren't going to talk about coronavirus, but now we're going to talk about coronavirus again. Because with everything on pause around the world, there's nothing immediate to report about the Tolkien series, except that New Zealand's success in keeping this whole thing under control has meant an initial loosening of restrictions, which is awesome, I guess. If it continues at a manageable pace, it's possible production would restart on the series sooner rather than later, but of course we'll just have to wait and see. The only other news is this flurry of unconfirmed reports that Tom Shippey has departed the production team, but there's no official comment from either Shippey or Amazon about this. It's just like internet rumor machine firing up.
Yeah, it's like one comment on one podcast, which we're not trying to discount because it sounded rather straightforward enough, but there's been nothing since, and it's been a couple of weeks now, so I'm half inclined to think vaporware. But who knows? Maybe something else is being worked out. So it would be a loss, though, precisely because he does seem to be not merely the guy who knows the material the best out of everyone, except maybe John Howe, but also seems to be the back channel more or less to the estate, even though the state's still directly involved. Who knows? So just one of those odd little mysteries. So there is some other news, Oriana, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, so this is a topic that we kind of haven't paid as much attention to in the past. We've got some official audiobook news. At the end of April, HarperCollins released an audiobook of one of Christopher Tolkien's last publications of his father's work, which is Beren and Luthien. And this audiobook features the father-son acting team of Timothy and Samuel West. You might remember them from their work on The Fall of Gondolin, which is also a HarperCollins book. And they received a fair amount of praise and nominations for various awards for The Fall of Gondolin. So might be worth checking out while we're all kind of waiting, doing not a whole lot. Although I'm pretty busy for the next couple weeks. So
all right. Well, lucky you. You can listen to that on the side. I was looking up more about the Wests themselves. Samuel West, in particular, seems to have done a lot of narration for a variety of audiobooks across the board. It's kind of maybe along the lines of someone like Simon Vance, who has done many adaptations as well. And so it's kind of interesting. I mean, I've been so associated Rob Inglis with doing official Tolkien stuff thanks to his versions of, I believe he did Hobbit as well as definitely Lord of the Rings. So it's sort of like, oh yeah, right, new readers and things. And to do something interesting that, previously the only official audiobook version as such of Beren and Luthien was Christopher Tolkien himself, reading from the version in the Silmarillion. So interesting to have a team sort of take on this particular story and do it that way. So I'm kind of intrigued to see how it works out. It's like maybe one's narrating and the other one's doing all the dialogue. I'm kind of curious to see exactly how this works as a team. So we'll have to find that one out. So, but there we are. So not much more else to add. I mean, it's nice to know things are happening, but things are only happening so much.
It is interesting that the production for the Amazon series it ended up being the right choice for many reasons to film in New Zealand. They've really been taking care of business as far as coronavirus is concerned. So it's sort of a bonus, I guess, of making the right choice.
Yeah, combination of good political will and action, and their isolation and their stringentness, I guess, is the best way to put it. So in terms of people coming in and out, if people have flown back from the production before, I don't know, maybe things shut down fully or something like that, if there's in the case, they'd have to come back, probably wait 14 days or something like that. I really have no idea what the restrictions are for people coming in and out, but I suspect that'll be the case from here on in. So not much more to add, so let's just move on to the main topic. This time around, it is Oriana's choice, so please, take it away.
Yes, so we are talking about adaptation. I don't want to belabor this too much because this topic, more than any other, probably benefits from me just kind of putting questions to the group, I guess. It's a huge topic that we can attack from any number of angles, and hopefully we will continue to do so in many episodes. But for now, as soon as I said adaptation, I'm sure you guys had a similar thought to mine, although I want to hear what exactly went through your head when I said adaptation, because for me, it is, of course, the Peter Jackson film trilogy, which is, it is a treasure. But then, there are BBC radio plays, musical stage versions, and, of course, the forthcoming Amazon TV series. What went through your head as soon as I said, we're talking about adaptation? What was the adaptation that you went, this?
Jared, you want
to? The Jackson movies. I mean, that was, they came out around the same, just the year after I first read Lord of the Rings. So it was the two are inextricably intertwined for me. It's not that is the adaptation. The others are just oh wait, that's right. There is an animated version too.
Right.
What? I forget that exists all the time. So for me, it was just the Jackson movies.
And for me, while again they're so dominant, certainly have to agree with that. As I mentioned many episodes ago, very first one. For me, the first adaptation that I almost can't escape because I listened to it so often when I was a kid was the Rankin Bass Hobbit specifically, and that was partially due to the fact that I had the soundtrack album, double soundtrack album. So weirdly enough, I'm almost used to the audio of it more than the video because of all the listening I did. But in combination with an official version of The Hobbit that was published as a trade paperback, sort of like a big square paperback that way, almost like a coffee table book, except it was a paperback. And it had the original Tolkien text, as well as various animation production cells and sketch drawings and things from the production. So it's a really nice accounting in a weird way, although not without any specific credits of the adaptation on that front. And that for me is kind of foundational, and I'll have more to say about it later. But one thing I think is underrated about that adaptation is there's probably one of the most faithful, although what is faithful, one of the most faithful adaptations to Tolkien that's ever been done, but not the most faithful. And again, I'll get into that later, but that's kind of those. So Peter Jackson, yes. Rankin Bass Hobbit is not far behind.
Yeah, that's definitely, how has your relationship with these adaptations changed over time? Has it changed at all? Have your feelings toward it changed as you have, or is it sort of an instant transportation back into the past?
we're all thinking about how to tackle this one, because that's a good question.
For me, I'll never have another experience like that in a movie theater. But the Jackson trilogies, I was so uncritical of them when I first
Yeah.
saw them. I was so uncritical. You know, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, I was like, yo, this rips. Like Legolas careening down an elephant's, snout. Like, hell yeah. You know, I was like, 15 or something. And now I can look at it with a much more critical eye. And I still love them and, again, treasure them. But it is interesting to see, to become more critical of it in a way that is not simply, well, this was in the book and this isn't. Like, it's interesting to see just how much I've grown in relation to the films themselves.
I think for me, I'm thinking about taking in those first viewings of each of the films in particular. Seeing Fellowship, which was not a midnight showing, because I think I was sort of hedging my bets. I'm like, I'm going opening night, but I won't necessarily go midnight. I'll just see. Although early reports shortly after that, people saying, no, they say it's really good. I'm like, okay, good. And I had my tickets for like 8 p.m. that thing, and I saw it in one of the big theaters, biggest ones in California. It's massive, so it's sort of like, all right, bring it on. And I just, it was just one of those things that's sort of like, okay, this is selling me. And I still remember just the sheer, it's almost like the literal impact, partially as the size of the screen, partially as the sound system, when after Sauron, implodes and blows up in the very beginning of the prologue, where the helm hits the ground. And it was sort of like, boom. And I'm like, I'm in. So maybe stepping back from that, though, I think what you were just bringing up, Oriana, is you're right. There was a vibe over those 3 years, let's say, in terms of waiting for the movies and sense of community and things like that interestingly, given the fact that for me, 77 was when I saw The Rankin Bass Hobbit, that's also when I saw Star Wars when I was 6.
Oh,
man. I'm sorry, damaged for life, and I freely own to that. So you could say my uncritical phase was way earlier.
Sure.
And when I saw the films, I'm in my early 30s. And it was a balance of that sort of visceral excitement you're talking about and a little sort of, okay, they changed this, they did, and, thinking through the changes as they went through. And the thing, though, that I will always remember, and I think I will always, this is why I always had faith in Jackson, let's say, is that when he was first announced he was going to do this back in 97, I went, the guy did Meet the Feebles? And what? And then I thought a minute, and then I went, he's very good at creating these self-contained things where the logic of everything in the films works and it's their own universe. He'll be fine.
Yeah.
And that turned out to be justified. I mean, it wasn't just him, of course, it's a team. But the point is, it was one of those things like, oh, no, wait, I think he's got this. And it turned out he did have it, so I didn't worry. I mean, I could say more, but I think you're right. There was a certain thrill that is still present but modified. We are looking back at the past. I am now looking back. We're all looking back now 20 years on. And,
oh, my God.
Wow.
Next year will be the 20th anniversary. I mean, that's how long it's been. It really has. And, we have to, there's certain things that will never quite be recaptured. There are a couple more specific things I can throw in later, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's definitely. Wait, Jared, did you answer the question? I don't want to move on. Okay.
I didn't really. We can edit this out, but can you say it again? Because I got a little turned around at some point here.
Oh, yeah. So has your relationship to the adaptations in particular changed over the last 20 years?
20
oh my God.
Yeah, my relationship to again, specifically to the Jackson trilogy has changed a lot. I think part of it is that he burned a lot of my goodwill with the Hobbit movies.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So now that if I look back at the original trilogy, all of the things that I just was able to ignore 20 years ago, I can't anymore. Just like weird little ticks of his filmmaking that I've never enjoyed, or just like, which isn't an issue adaptation so much as just like, a directorial style.
Sure.
Right.
But yeah, like I look at them and I think there's different choices that could have been made that would have made it. I mean, what am I trying to say? Like even something as simple as casting people of color or whatever. It's like they're not issues of adaptation so much as issues of plastic representation or whatever. That sounds dismissive. I don't know. It's just I look back and now the things that I see are things that I don't think were done correctly, which is kind of sad for me because when they came out, I was like, oh my God, this is the only version that should ever exist.
Yeah.
And they do a ton of stuff right. But yeah, I think I don't want to say outgrown them, but I mean, on some level, they're no longer what they were to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, for me, I think the process has been for most of the aughts. I was pretty much, I had having steeped myself in the original text for so long, almost 20 plus years at that point. I don't want to say made the movies my primary text, but I just lost myself in them again and again, and just started taking in. And it was partially because it was a matter of presentation and packaging. I mean, the DVDs, of course, famously, all the
Yeah.
commentaries,
yeah.
all the
Oh
extra
my
stuff.
God.
Those religiously.
Marvelous. I mean, it's a moment in time that now really isn't even recaptured. Even the physical media changing how we conceive extras. It just
Yep.
it did. The Hobbit didn't even get that detailed. which I think was kind of a loss. But they expanded on some other points. But it was just one of those things that you could just go like taking it all in, and rereading Tolkien in the past few years, as I've been more consciously trying to make an effort to do, has been a good way to sort of take myself back into the pre-Jackson mindset. It's sort of like, okay, what does the story look like now that I'm reading it again, especially these later on, which has been good. My recent reread of LOTR was really helpful in that regard, because you could see the changes even more clearly, I think, with a little distance. And this may be part for more another question or a wider issue, but I think something about any adaptation of Tolkien, and this is arguably any adaptation of literature, let's be fair,
Yeah.
is the removal of the narrative voice.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you don't have a narrator, and Tolkien's narrators in his various works all have a very key role. And again, you could say that almost about any novel of work and things like this. Is just the nature of the beast of adapting. But I think that's the sort of, that's transformative, more can be said about it. One thing I'll throw in, and just this is a little fun observation. I just remember a time, because it's a good mindset portrayal of fandom and also adaptation that happened. This was in Belaman's comic strip Foxtrot, which I don't know if you ever read it, but I frankly loved it for many years, because I thought it was like, oh, this is like the best sitcom that's not an actual sitcom. And Jason, of course, the youngest, is the one who's the total nerd. He's the classic. He's the one standing in for Belaman himself. And there was a sequence about 5 months or so before Fellowship came out, and he and his best friend Marcus it was daydream that they had ended up as extras on the Fellowship of the Ring shooting set.
I remember that,
playing hobbits or things like this. Yeah, it was like a classical week on scenes, because he did that all the time. Anytime a new big nerdy thing coming out, he was pretty much in there. Again, a man knows his audience and men knows his kid. Perfect. It was really great. And daydreaming there, and Peter Jackson was featured as just a character. And at one point, like, Jason and Marcus say something like, "Well, how come you cut this bit?" Again, he was guessing. No one had seen the film yet. He was just guessing and saying, "How come we're not doing the full thing?" And Peter Jackson's like, "Well, you got to understand, you guys. If we filmed everything, the movie would be about 20 hours long, and that wouldn't work, guys." And then, like, Jason and Marcus were just there going like, 20-hour movie, it's just like, yes, but and that, I think, is sort of like, that really just sort of, it captures the sense of adaptation. You want everything, you're never going to get anything. It's a question of the choices made, and that, I think, is something you, Oriana, with your spec script work and other things, have worked directly with. What do you take from the source material, and how do you shape it into something? And that's, of course, what Jackson had to do. That's and his team, and Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens, etc., and any other adaptation of Tolkien has had to do. What do you keep? What do you let go?
Exactly. And then you actually raise a point that, my next question was actually going to be, okay, so what are the essential elements of an adaptation of Tolkien's work? Like, what are the key qualities, not necessarily narrative like beats, because those can be changed in any number of ways, and still remain true to the spirit of whatever work is being adapted. The first thing that springs to my mind is sincerity. There needs to be sincerity, and yet also a tremendous sense of humor, which is part of where the Hobbit trilogy in particular went so wrong. Is losing all that humor and lightness and quickness. That is actually like an incredible textbook example of how not to adapt one of Tolkien's stories. What do you guys think are some essential elements?
A huge essential element, which the Jackson movies got perfectly, was this respect for the natural world, this sort of awe at just the universe around you, which they did beautifully. and this sense of age and history that the books have by people mentioning, offhanded things like the Gladden Fields. They'll never come up, but they're there. They're important. Visually, they did that by including ruins, which is so cool. But just like, the Fellowship in the first movie walks past this hill. It's got like a ruined fort on it. And it's never mentioned. It's just there.
Yeah.
Which just adds to the sense of history, which they managed to do without adding weird dialogue about, and this is the fort of whatever.
Kragencourt.
or somebody like constantly mentioning names off screen or whatever. They just included things that are old and run down and never talked about. And Tolkien does that too, just linguistically. Yeah, it was just, I thought that was great.
Yeah, there's a small touch of that. I remember it's in one of the commentaries for Fellowship where they have the very brief bit where Gandalf goes to Minas Tirith and is searching through the scrolls to find out information about the ring. And I think it was Jackson or somebody saying, like, we thought about putting up a thing saying, oh, this is Minas Tirith. They're like, what's the point? Why bother? Let's just put it in there, because they just get back to it. They just have it be a thing, and just he's gone somewhere, and it looks sort of serious over there on the horizon, but I'm in the city now briefly and just doing this. And that turned out to be the right move. The thing that I think has to be captured, and I brought this up a little bit at the end of the previous episode about one of the strengths of Tolkien and, sense of evil, is, again, it is internal, so much of it. There's externalized evil. You are doing evil things. You're off conquering or doing whatever. But everything is very much internal. And again, we have no narrator. And you can't really translate, adaptations have tried. But it's really damn hard to translate an internal monologue into something that looks good on the screen. I'll throw you an example of something. Their internal monologues are huge in this particular book. And you try to make them work for the movie. And that's David Lynch's adaptation of Dune.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah.
I'm very curious to see what Denis Villeneuve, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, will do with his adaptation that's coming out at the end of the year. Crossed fingers. Lynch, for whatever reason, it is David Lynch, he can do what he wants.
Right.
He decided to do an adaptation where, they're just, you get people just sort of standing off and staring into the distance and just people doing whispery voiceovers in their head. And it's not good cinema. You're explaining the story, but it just sucks for cinema. You don't have that in Jackson's thing. And in fact, I think very telescopically, he's able to boil it down to key moments where you see people maybe having brief moments of, struggle, again, briefly, but nothing too crazy. Frodo, of course, is the big example, and it's a combination of the visual, you sort of like the obsessive looking at the ring, sort of the sense of hearing it. It's sort of like it teases it out without beating it into the ground. And it's a hard balance, and there's no one way to do it, but I think it's done very well. I think the moments where Faramir, who is an example of a character changed by adaptation, to make, that's something we can talk about. But, the way Faramir turns out, having his own temptations go, etc. I will bring up with the Rankin Bass an interesting example of The Hobbit, of how that internalized thing worked very well in a much different context. And that is the key point from my mind in The Hobbit in terms of character development as such, is when Bilbo is going down to meet Smaug for the first time, and he has to overcome his fear and basically what he's doing. And there's a key bit of internal monologue. That actually is in the Rankin Bass Hobbit. But it's done in a way that it's a little shorter, but the key points are there. It's a little more, but it's a case where Orson Bean's delivery is very, very good. He really was a wonderful casting choice for both Bilbo and Frodo for both the Rankin Bass adaptations. I thought he did a solid job. And his Bilbo is, I think, easily one of the best Bilbos that's ever been done. And he captures the earnestness, and he captures the sense of, I'm facing something big here. Do I go back? No. And it's done and staged and shown well enough that even though it is a character thinking these thoughts, an animated character for that matter, thinking these thoughts approaching Smaug, it works. And that's a very interesting example of how internal dialogue and something, the internalist thing in Tolkien, where something is described but not said, how that can be translated to the screen. And again, it's hard to do, but I think it has to be given credit as something where it can actually maintain that pretty well.
Yeah, that's the key here, is having directors who trust their actors, I think, is how you manage that. Because it's a big burden to transpose from this narrative voice onto the shoulders of your actors, whether, they're just lending their voices to animated figures or, whether they're actually on screen. The Faramir thing that you bring up, that was one thing that I hate. That was a change that I absolutely hated as a kid. But as I kind of understood more about how you tell stories, the more I have come around to it, going like, oh yeah, no, it does make a little more sense to have, because otherwise it's just like, and then this thing happened and he was never tempted at all and it was fine. And it's like, oh, well, that's okay. I can see how that might be kind of boring. I still don't necessarily love it because I loved Faramir and felt that it was a form of character assassination. But I get it now.
We could use that as an entry point for something. Mm-hmm. When you're doing adaptation, especially if you're going from book to movie, you've got to balance the dramatic and the thematic.
Yes.
And thematically, Faramir rejecting the ring in the book is a statement about how he doesn't want power.
Right.
He's one of the few characters, he's like a hobbit. He just doesn't want authority. So he's not susceptible to the ring. But in the movies, having a human who's like, above all else, they desire power, having a human go, no thanks, I'm good, does kind of undercut that.
Yeah.
But Faramir...
He's so good!
He's such a good boy!
It is in the book, particularly. It's a nice dichotomy it sets up with him and Boromir. And yes, Boromir hasn't... But then again, in the adaptation, in the Jackson films, Boromir is infinitely better as a character. He's... Because Sean Bean is so good and because... it's been tweaked a little to show he's not a bad guy. He, it shows the insidiousness of the ring in an interesting way that is relatable. So thank you, Sean Bean.
Well, it's also the two, Faramir and Boromir are kind of in conversation, in two separate books about how this all works. Like Boromir is like, we should use the ring, as everybody knows, we should use the ring to defend Minas Tirith and all that. And Faramir is like, no, it's not worth the cost to our own souls if we use the ring, which is an interesting point of view. And you could argue about whether he's correct, because it means, people dying. But that point of view then gets subtracted from the movie, and it becomes much more like, simplistic is the wrong word.
Well, a bit.
I don't know. It takes out some of the thematic richness in favor of like more drama.
Right. You're losing a bit of nuance when it comes to men as a quote unquote race.
That's a whole other conversation.
Oh boy. We've talked a bit about, Ned, you've been talking about the animation, the animated adaptations. What would you guys like to see if you had, infinite money and resources? What do you think, whether it's a readaptation that has of whether you want to see a Lord of the Rings miniseries or whatever, what work would you like to see adapted the most, and what would the format be? Would it be a movie, a film, animation, live action, tone poem?
Oh, that's a good one. Jared, you want to go first? I have to think about this.
I've got two here. They're sort of related, I guess. They're both Ursula Le Guin, because I am the biggest Ursula Le Guin fan. I would love to see Earthsea done properly, because we don't talk about the sci-fi adaptation.
Oh, I forgot about that.
Oh, it sucks so bad.
And Studio Ghibli was kind of a nah.
It was okay. I love the dragons in Studio Ghibli.
Yes.
I think it would make a good TV show if whoever makes it would be willing to let it breathe the way the story breathes, where there's a lot of scenery maybe and a lot less dialogue.
Yeah.
That, and I would love to see almost like an anthology show adaptation of her Heinisch cycle, like The Left Hand of Darkness and The Dispossessed and all that. I think that would make a great, because they're not about space travel, they're about existing in one place for long periods of time. So you could totally do an anthology series with this one setting. And I think that would be awesome.
Is there a Tolkien property that you would like to see redone or done in the first place?
I would love to see The Hobbit done in the first place.
Right? Wouldn't that be nice?
It would be great if somebody decided to adapt The Hobbit.
Someone should do that.
Yeah, no, but I think I would love to see more of the Silmarillion adapted.
Yeah.
I think we're going to get some of it with the Amazon show, but
yeah, maybe.
There's so much in the Silmarillion, and there's so much that's not in the Silmarillion that you could really cut loose as long as you hit the major plot points. And you could go completely buck wild because of how much totally insane crap happens in the Silmarillion. I would love to see that. It would be a massive, difficult undertaking. I would probably end up hating it, but I would love to see it attempted.
As for me, if we're talking non-Tolkien, I was trying to think, if we're talking, frankly, if we're talking not even science fiction, Dorothy Dunnett's novel cycles would be fantastic, but that's a whole nother conversation. And if we're talking SF fantasy, I would say either from my younger reading, the work of P.C. Hodgkill, and if we're more recent, N.K. Jemisin stuff, which frankly is a series of rich texts.
Isn't
hopefully
that
something
happening?
Yeah, there's the TNT thing in the works, isn't there?
Yeah,
is something.
I think so.
I mean, there's
well, God only knows when.
Yeah, there's other excellent writers, recent writers who are like getting their work done and adapted. I can never pronounce her name; it's terrible. Nikki Odafor, I think is her name, or something like that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and she's got one of her novels is I think it's already been filmed or something like that. The deal was announced a year ago, so I believe that'll be happening. But in terms of Tolkien, yeah, I was thinking about this. What would be this will actually here's what I'll suggest in terms of what I think will be an interesting adaptation, because I like to talk about one of my other favorite adaptations of Tolkien, and this is actually. Possibly, I mentioned Rankin Bass as my kind of second favorite adaptation of The Hobbit, which, if maybe for a separate episode on it alone, I could say more about like how it works and doesn't and all that, and that'll be another time, because I think there's a lot to unpack with it. I think it's a very interesting production on a number of different levels. But the most successful one that I've ever seen is, I'm getting the info here so that people know it. It is available. It was out of print for a while, but it all came back. Is a version of The Hobbit that was done for Eclipse Comics back in 1989. This was done by Charles Dixon and David Wenzel. Charles Dixon did the adaptation. David Wenzel did the art, and this was done as 3 issues. That was then published as a separate standalone trade paperback in 1990, which I had for years. Again, went out of print. It came back into print in 2012 with some slightly new cover art and some new things. It's a very, very, very faithful and lovely version of The Hobbit, and the reason why I like it is because it manages the trick of keeping a lot of the language. There's basically all the language is in there. It's not every last little bit in terms of description or anything like that, but the narrative voice, the narrator's voice, appears as sort of like descriptions and captions as it goes, and it flows very well. And the art is lovely. It is not hyper stylized. It is not straight up cartoony. It is instead just sort of, I don't want to say a pleasant adaptation. It sounds kind of weird, but it has the knack of things. It has the hints of your classic Wyeth illustrations and other things from the early 1900s, but it isn't simply a replication of that. And it is something that is a little more, just lived in, human. I don't know how you put it and all that. There have been a couple of interesting interviews with Wenzel in particular over time that sort of explains more where he was coming from. But I like it because it provides its own particular visual sense of what a Tolkien's world could be like through the Hobbit lens. But it does so that is neither the Rankin Bass nor the Jackson nor the Hildebrandt versions, if we're talking other fan art and things like this, nor all these other ones that have come out. It's its own particular thing, and it's its own particular self-contained thing, and it's not unknown, but it's a little underrated. And I think it captures things like that moment where Bilbo is going down to face Smaug very, very well, and it's a very good instance of adaptation in the comic world, one can say. That is a perfectly fine medium. So maybe building off of that, there you go, Jared. Yes. So building off of that, maybe the adaptation I would like to see is maybe the same team or a team with another team with a really good sort of sense of this tackling Lord of the Rings. And I think this team could do it if they wanted to. And I want to say they mentioned saying it would be lovely, but they never had the chance to, or it hasn't really come up yet. And it's been some time. It may have to be a younger team to look at different things and maybe bring in different angles, things that have their own style with it. But I think a really really solid, limited run comic adaptation official of Lord of the Rings would be quite remarkable. I think it'd be a really good way to bring in a lot of interesting, different visual ideas, different ideas of quote unquote casting, how the characters look, the armor, everything else. There's room for a new, strong visual adaptation that is not necessarily a new movie or a new TV series.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why I love this Hobbit adaptation. And that's the thing I would say would be a really welcome. Bring it to the fore. Why can't this be done? Why can't this be tried? Let's see how this could work, especially in the comic world that we now find ourselves in. Whether it's downloading it or how you get it and things like this. There are so many different ways to try this. I think it would be a really welcome twist.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I'm still pushing for my 5-season animated Silmarillion TV series.
Oh yeah.
That's my dream. Although it does kind of bring two more questions before I shut up.
Keep going. It's your topic.
The first one is the rights. That is the biggest issue for anyone who wants to do any kind of adaptation of this material. Ned, you are our resident rights expert here. What have been some of the challenges that people who have wanted to adapt have faced when attempting to? Is it because it's not just a money issue? I mean, you need a lot of money, but what are some of the Mr. Insider?
Well, I mean, I claim no true real insight, but I mean, a lot of it was determined by the fact that when Saul Zaentz got the rights to The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings way back in the late 60s, early 70s, I forget which, and held on to those rights, he pretty much was able to make the call on his own without the involvement of the estate in any form, which was part of the deal. And so the estate pretty much had to go, while everything was going on. And so Zaentz was sort of like, okay, who can print me money? And all that. So, he got no cut from the books. The books were always going to be their own things, your actual texts and all that, and official adaptations of all the rest of it. But any sort of licensing thing would have to go through him. And that's pretty much how all the adaptations that we've seen over time have come across. I would be interested in knowing, and I would like to talk briefly a bit more about this adaptation, if that included the BBC early 80s radio series. I don't know if it did. My sense is that it was actually more an official estate production, and there may be some other factor going on with that. I don't know. But Zaentz was the one pretty much, Rankin Bass had to go through him. Ralph Bakshi, that team that had to go through that. The Iron Crown Enterprises role-playing games, which are an adaptation in their own right. We should not ignore that. That is, they're the gaming adaptations. And similarly, a lot of the later gaming stuff that happened, again, had to go through Zaentz. When the Jackson adaptations happened, there was like both the official and not really official, but still licensed gaming things going on, which is sort of like some were from the movies and others were due to Zaentz's thing, because and again, the movies themselves, you'll see Zantz's name in the end credits there. He was sort of like, yep, hi. Tolkien Enterprises was just sort of chicking along going like, life is good. Right. So I mean, you could argue things are simpler now. I can't remember if the rights have actually fully reverted or not, or the estate finally put their foot down or something expired. I don't know. That's something that I really would like to sort of figure out some more. The two things I would note are this. One reason, among the other reasons, that the Jackson Hobbit adaptations didn't work is that they could only go so far. There's kind of a classic example in this, is that there's the bit in the first Hobbit movie where Bilbo and Gandalf are talking when they're on the road, and he's asking about what all the other wizards are, and he's saying like, oh, well, there's Radagast and there's Saruman, and there's the other two, I've forgotten their names and all that. And that is true on the one hand. Their names are randomly mentioned Unfinished Tales, but here's the key point. They didn't have the rights to Unfinished Tales. You couldn't use the names. This is my understanding of how to do it. You get this weird sort of parsing about what you can actually bring in and what you can't. And that's another reason why the Hobbit films are kind of weird, because instead of using some of the material that is in the Unfinished Tales, talking a little bit more about the wider context that Tolkien himself developed, they kind of had to dream up their own. Doesn't really work.
No.
They didn't have to, though. They didn't need need to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's another example of adaptation, and that is the thing. Maybe this ties back into the Faramir point too. Here's the thing. Faramir is symptomatic, I would say, of in a weirdly good way, I would argue, of the Jackson adaptations being for Lord of the Rings, reflecting a certain tone that is consistent throughout those three films, namely that the stakes are higher and everyone's a little more desperate and doing things that they might not otherwise be doing.
Mm.
And to tie in with the point about you can't have Faramir, a man, in there with the ring and not have him be tempted because it goes against things, it's important to remember that there's already been a serious temptation in the films earlier with a man, and that is Aragorn, who does not have a temptation movement in the book at all. And he's given one right at the end of Fellowship of the Ring. So in some respects, having that in, it sort of makes sense. It's like it hits everybody. Well, no matter how they pretend otherwise, it hits everybody hard. And it especially hits men hard. But it also explains why, Rohan seems a little more desperate, while Theoden seems a little more bitter about Gondor. Everything is sort of like
just dialed up. Dial it up.
It's ratcheted up, and I'd argue that partially in trying to recapture that to a degree for their versions of The Hobbit, that's another reason why Jackson's versions didn't work. But anyway, I could go on. Gosh, I sidetracked us a bit there, but
no, talking about the weird parsing of the rights, as in, you don't have the ability to say the names of these two characters because you don't have the rights to the book that they appear in. That is interesting to me because of what we know and don't know about the rights that were given to Amazon Studios to make the forthcoming Lord of the Rings series. We don't really know the exact language of the contract and what exactly they had access to in terms of material, because it feels weird. It would feel very strange for them to have this world in the Second Age in Numenor and not be able to talk at all about, say, Beren and Luthien or Arendelle, because they don't have the rights to those.
They have the rights. This is where Tom Shippey comes in handy, because I remember one of the things, I think we talked about this in an episode briefly last year, I can't remember, but I think Tom Shippey was clear in the interview he gave to that German site about how the estate has pretty much said to Amazon, no adaptations of stuff from the First Age. However, that doesn't mean you couldn't refer to that material, maybe.
Okay.
And so it's the type of thing
Although
that,
still sucks.
It still sucks, but maybe there's a way for, characters to, tell a story or interpret it or sort of things like this. So there may be a way to sort of bring it in without fully bringing it in, or there may be some way to do it in a prologue or something like this. These are good questions. I honestly don't know what the answer is. I mean, the starting point of the whole thing is something we've been puzzling at for a while. We won't know until it actually shows. And that, I think, will answer a lot about what's going on.
Right. It's one of those things where, if you can't have Elrond or Celebrimbor talking about things that happened at the very least, then it cuts back on the richness that you can build. It cuts back on the world building you can do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the estate's prerogative, of course, but it would be kind of a bummer if their hands were that tied. But that also kind of brings me to my last real question, which is, should we even be still adapting Tolkien in the first place?
Ooh. What's your thought?
I'll let you guys go first.
Okay, all right. Jared, you want to plunge in, or shall I do it?
I can stumble towards an answer here.
Yes.
I think yes, but
good way of looking at it.
I don't think there's an easy way to do this, but yes, but as long as there are other things that are also, as long as it's not sucking up all the oxygen in the room.
Right.
Which I know there's like a viral tweet about this or something where you go to a bookstore and there's shelves of Tolkien and it's 6 different editions of every single book. And then writers like N.K. Jemisin or whoever are they've got their own little section, one copy of each book.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I
think there's a similar problem in the adaptation world. So it's a little more complicated than just selling books, obviously, where, Lord of the Rings has been adapted several times. There's all these audiobooks. There's the Amazon series. There's all this stuff that's coming out, but I feel like I personally don't need another adaptation if it means that a new voice is being overlooked.
Mm-hmm,
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, and adaptation brings in a wider audience. Tons of people read the books because they saw the movies.
Right.
If there's no big screen version of Cassandra Kaw's chef horror novels, her work may not find as big an audience as it deserves. It's
Right. Mm-hmm.
It's not a question, or not an answer to the question exactly, because it's not whether we should be, it's whether we should also be.
No, I think that's exactly my feelings on it. I hate that it is kind of a zero-sum game. There is a finite amount of resources and financing available, and to have it be lavished on projects that of course they're near and dear to my heart, and I would, my God, I will push for a Silmarillion series till my last day.
Mm-hmm.
But that's that's selfish me. That's like, I don't actually need that. It's not actually, I'm not going to use up all of my time on this earth doing that. It's true. Maybe it is time to start looking beyond this.
Mm-hmm.
As much as I would love a redo, a proper redo of The Hobbit, do we need it?
Yeah, I mean, my thought is that we've had Tolkien, we've had Rowling, and we've had Martin, that collectively sucking up huge amounts of oxygen.
Yeah,
and they are still. I mean, we have, there's the Rowling prequel series, there's the Martin prequel stuff that's coming out. There's, in terms of adaptations,
mm-hmm.
and of course we have the one here. So yeah, now it's not that they're the only ones. I mean, as we mentioned a couple times before, Amazon's got its other big fantasy series with the Robert Jordan Wheel of Time one. So it's sort of like, there's more coming down the pike. But I think there is very much room, and by mentioning Jemison and other writers, I think, I think there's very much room for this. The idea that we don't have to adhere to these particular models as the only models for fantasy. Jared brought up saying it'd be great to get a proper Earthsea adaptation. Those rights have been, set up. I believe someone's going to be doing something with that, so cross your fingers. It would be good to step away from explicit hero narratives to a degree, or at least quest-focused ones like this. Other ways to sort of establish how to do things. I mean, it would be interesting if this is a very, very this is a skew-whiff way of looking at it. But I think it might help in terms of, especially modern prestige TV audiences, for a way to frame what we're talking about here, is that whether it's an adaptation or even something original, but I think adaptation would be better, and I think it would be ways to do the storytelling structures and approaches of series like, let's say, Deadwood, or The Wire, or things like that, applied to certain fantasy universes, let's say, or given how certain fantasy series and worlds have been set up and explored, is there a way to take these kind of models and sort of do that and have something that may be a little more appropriate, maybe I guess is not the best word, but something that's sort of imaginative in terms of what can be brought to that in terms of exploring a world, in terms of doing something a little differently. This, I think, really depends on the intent of the original source material being adapted, I grant you.
Yeah.
But this is where something like Le Guin's world can be very handy, because it doesn't really have hero narratives. If anything, it's critiquing them.
Yeah.
It is giving a sense of societies developing in their own particular ways and shapes and forms and fashions. That could lead to these kinds of different sort of adaptations or approaches, or, things set in the world of. You don't necessarily have that in Tolkien. It's not that it's not there, but it's underexplored. And the author himself maybe seems to have been the one least interested in these alternate viewings, even though they could be brought to bear.
Yeah.
So, it's sort of like, it would be, a Gondorian soldier grunt level eye view of the entire War of the Ring would be a very interesting thing to see, for instance.
Or everything done in the style of a small drama like Aldarion and Erendis.
Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, a very good example of showing how that's in Tolkien. There is something there, it's just a question of how you choose to bring it to it. I think I don't want to say I'll wrap up here with thoughts, but I want to make the case for my other favorite adaptation of the key story of Lord of the Rings itself, and that would be, as I mentioned, the BBC radio series, which is not perfect. I'm not gonna put it say like it is the ultimate adaptation, but it's incredibly good, and it takes advantage of another form of presentation that is kind of underrated, but is something that was especially much more, one could say, relevant and huge in the early in the mid century, I should say, of mid 20th century, and that is the radio drama. That is the radio adaptation. I mean, these things were in the same way that stage adaptations of classic works of literature in the 19th century were massive in America, and in terms like this, people were adapting them, theatrical presentations. You read stories about how everyone knew their Shakespeare because there were always people, going around the Midwest doing that. In the 20th century, you have in many different countries, many different things, radio adaptations of the great works of literature. And to a degree, what we have is there's a brio, one could say, to the adaptation of that Brian Sibley oversaw in the early '80s, where you have these, there's a good staginess in much of the adaptation done for radio, but there's also a good earnestness too, a good more naturalistic point of view. Ian Holm is one of the best Frodos. I mean, he's almost unique in that, along with Orson Bean, as I mentioned, who pulled off a really good Bilbo and Frodo for Rankin Bass. Ian Holm pulled off an incredible Frodo for the BBC, and then pulled off a great Bilbo for Peter Jackson.
Yeah.
So like, those two, they're the ones who figured it out. So they did a very good job. And Bill Nighy's performance as Sam is deeply underrated and is easily the equal of Sean Astin's in Jackson's Lord of the Rings. It's the two best Sams that have yet been done, to my mind, at least in terms of a dramatic adaptation. I think there's room for thinking about adaptations of Tolkien that don't have to be the big money shot of a movie type thing, or even a TV adaptation. And I think the fact that we are seeing, so much in the way and genre of this kind of, modern radio thing, the 21st century audio drama presentation.
Yeah.
The Doctor Who presentations are a good example. I mean, there have now been slews of them, and a lot of the, older doctors who are not, or no longer the current Doctor on TV are doing these. And by all accounts, I have friends who just say, "Oh, those are so fantastic. They were great." And, this is the type of thing I think, can we expand our minds to how to do adaptations in different ways so it isn't something so hugely dominant, so crazily done, like with Bezos throwing down the $250 million.
Right.
The $250 million to be able to film this, it's sort of like great, but it's not the only way. There
Right.
are different ways to think about this, and there are ways to bring up other presentations to do things, adaptations and original work too,
Yeah.
in ways that expand the palette, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah.
Now, is the BBC adaptation available anywhere? Because I've never heard it.
Me neither. I actually want to check this out.
It is available. I believe you can get it. I don't know necessarily it's Audible or something like that, but it is available for sale. It is. I think the BBC finally, it was licensed to another bunch over here a few times. I think the BBC is a little more conscious these days. They're sort of like trying to like have a direct sort of like things with that. But it has been released on CD, released on tape. I'm sure it's available digitally. You do have to keep in mind it is a early '80s presentation. It is different. There is, and it has it again. It allow for the staginess, but it's a good staginess, and the voice casting really is stellar throughout. And I will give I wrote I'll put this in the comments, put this in the show notes, I should say. But I wrote a piece for the Quietus a couple of years ago about the late '70s, early '80s clutch of Tolkien adaptations that happened.
Yeah, I remember reading this. It was so good.
Thank you. And in talking about it in the series, the thing I noted is that there are two castings in Bakshi's Lord of the Rings that are replicated in Sibley's radio version. Interestingly enough, and arguably, in both cases, it's strictly voice acting. So I mean, why not? It would have been interesting if taken the whole cast over, but he didn't. But hey, what can you do? And that he took over. I cannot remember the actor's name, but it was the one who did Boromir. And did, I think, a much stronger version in the BBC than how he was sort of stuck with in the Bakshi, but what can you do? But the real revelation is Peter Woodthorpe as Gollum. He's very good in the Bakshi Lord of the Rings. It's a small part throughout, but it's still pretty well done. But it's almost like okay, that was the initial go round. 4 years later, he does it for the much fuller adaptation for Sibley and the BBC. Oh, astounding. It is nothing against Andy Serkis, who, of course, a phenomenal brother Theodore's version of him for Rankin Bass is very, very good too. It's not that you can't do Gollum wrong, but the best ones are always sort of like, you really got to sort of step up your game. And Woodthorpe's, I think, is still kind of the one that's hardest to beat. It's incredibly well done. It's written well, and it's performed very, very well. And because it is unlike the speaking of adaptations, unlike the Jackson version, it can afford to be more faithful.
Yeah.
And it is more faithful down the line. It in terms of beats, there's no radical revision of anything. There's no change around in Faramir, et cetera, anything like that. Is that it's sort of like, okay, this is as close as you can get to a near complete version. That's not someone reading a book. That's not Rob Inglis just reading it, which you can get to, of Lord of the Rings in an adaptation. And I think it's worth listening to at least once. It won't work for all. It won't totally work, but it gets very close. That's the thing to keep in mind. And the great thing about it, and this is always going to be the thing with radio versions, is that whether it's a TV version, a movie version, a comic version, you can see what's going on. A radio version inevitably has, I'm falling, or, oh, look over there. And, there are these moments, it's like, yeah, I know why you're doing this, but what can you do? But that's radio. That's the quirk of radio. That's how radio things work. That's how an adaptation works. These are the trade-offs. This is what you do.
I think we have covered everything. At some point, we should probably talk about adaptations of The Hobbit in particular, because I think there are so many different ones that have failed and others that have not. So, yeah, look forward to that at some point.
We'll get around to it. And maybe here's a question for you, maybe to sort of end it on. So as mentioned, I mildly mentioned, you said a couple times before, you have done spec script stuff adapting Tolkien. So you have actually addressed this in your own work. Maybe if you want to wrap it up, is what have you found was the greatest, I don't know if the word is challenge, but what do you think is sort of like, okay, how do I make this work in a way that works as a screenplay? What are the key things I learned from trying that?
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote a spec for the Amazon Lord of the Rings series, pretending that, okay, let's say that Aldarion and Eredis are going to be major figures. How do I do this? And the first is introducing the world is extremely challenging. Introducing the history without overwhelming either the script reader or the audience is extremely difficult, even knowing that people generally know what Lord of the Rings is about. This is, before that. So, no one really knows much about Numenor. So it's a challenge, and yet there's so much to work with. It's one thing I had to do a lot of was when we did the episode on that story for this show, Ned, you had me read that scathing speech that Eredis gives about how men are trash. And it's an amazing speech to read, but it doesn't, you have to change it so that it sounds like words that a person would actually speak aloud. It just doesn't quite, as good as it is, you can't speak it. Just doing things like that. It's a really great lesson in taking the bones of something, taking the emotion underneath, and letting that be your guide as you translate it. Even though it is still technically, it's still the written word. So you just have to use your imagination too, which is, if you don't have a specific actor in mind, that can be really difficult. Mm-hmm. To try and figure out how things will actually sound. I cannot read things. I cannot read my own work out loud. I know you're supposed to do that. I can't. I just can't do it. I never will. I'm sorry to all of my teachers who insisted on doing that. But yeah, it's harder than it looks. But it's really fun at the same time. It's the good kind of hard.
Well, let's now look ahead to our next episode. The choice of topics is Jared's. So, what are we talking about next time?
So, speaking of adaptations, this isn't exactly an adaptation, but it's close enough. I would like to talk about his translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
Ooh. Oh, nice. Excellent.
because I love that poem.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to talk about it. I don't, not to like jump the gun on the next episode, but I think it's interesting that it doesn't seem to have had any influence on him the way Beowulf has, that kind of thing. But it is, so it's a little bit outside what we think of as Tolkien-esque.
Yeah.
But he did a translation of it that I think, like, right before he died, I think. It came out posthumously, I believe.
Yeah, he worked on it. Well, we'll talk more about it in the episode.
But yeah, it's a really interesting piece of Middle English literature. And apparently he liked it. So I would just like broaden the field a little bit.
Yeah.
Talk about things that he liked. So
yeah, that's really great. Yeah, no, I mean, a number of, while Christopher Tolkien over the last, over the last 2 decades, did create the 3 sort of collections of, great extended versions, you could say, of the various core Silmarillion tales. A lot of what he published from his father's work over the past 20 years were his translations, or were his more scholarly, or more like, things done in a particular vein or a particular style, whether it was the Sigurd stories or King Arthur or things like that. So yeah, no, this is not something we should ignore. It's definitely his more scholarly side, but it is good to look at for that reason. I mean, that is what the field he worked in.
And I actually haven't read it.
It's so good.
So this is a great opportunity.
Ned, have you read it?
I believe I've read more than one translation over time, but I have definitely read his. I remember reading that a couple of times, at least back when I was a teenager. I had there was a paperback edition that had that, and Pearl and Sir Orfeo were like the 3 that were packaged together. I don't know if that's still an edition that's out there, but it is out there. So if you're interested, we encourage you, go read it before next time.
Now I do have to say, I have not read his translation. Because
so you've read a translation, but not his.
I've read 2 other translations, which are both amazing.
But
cool. I haven't read his because this is such a weird little sidebar. But my first experience with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was when I was a kid, having just read either The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, saw it in the library and thought, "Heck yes, more Tolkien!" Picked it up and was like, "What the hell is that?" And then I put it down and I didn't read it until this year, and not his version yet. But yeah, I avoided it for 20 years because it wasn't his original work.
Well, my best friend from college, I remember her, like, I had like the Lord of the Rings books on my little bookshelf in our dorm room, and she was like, I had to read the Tolkien version of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and I absolutely hated it, and I hate Tolkien, and I was like, uh-oh. But we ended up best friends anyway.
Aww.
That's the kind of disagreement you can get over.
Quality of a person shines through regardless.
Right,
that's a good thing.
Right.
Yes.
It's all right.
There you go. All right. Well, that is fantastic. I am looking forward to that. That's a really good idea for an episode. That'll be a great discussion coming up. We can even talk about the other versions of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight over time, like the legendarily terrible film version with Miles O'Keefe and Sean Connery from the 80s, which, oh boy. but that's, yeah. Well,
and there's a new movie version coming out this year.
Wait, there is?
With Dev Patel.
Oh, hello.
Have you seen? Oh, you gotta watch the trailer. It's my favorite. I love movie trailers, and this is my new favorite.
I know of at least one listener to this podcast who pretty much just lost her shit when that trailer came out. So,
I did. I 100% did too.
Hey, that's very good. I totally forgotten about that. Yes, that's right. That is coming out. All right. Well, we'll have more to talk about that next time. We'll see you all in a month, of course, and all that. So again, stay well, stay safe, and we will talk to you at that time in June. My goodness, it's already going to be June when we have the next episode. This year. But in any event, until that time, talk to you then. Thanks again for listening to this episode of By the Bywater. Please subscribe and rate us via your favorite podcast listening options.
Episodes and show notes are at megaphonic.fm/bythebywater, all one word. You can also message us through here. Email us at bythebywater@megaphonic.fm, or follow us on Twitter at By-The-Bywater.
You can also follow us individually on Twitter and ask questions there. I'm at Vandroid Helsing.
I'm at Schwinter, SCHWINDTER.
And I'm Ned Raggett. 2 G's, 2 T's. By-The-Bywater is a proud member of Megaphonic Podcast Network. Find all our fancy little shows at megaphonic.fm. We hope you join us again next time. Until then, Namarie.